Elizabeth Carter's world had become a landscape of shadows and granite. At 57, the widow found solace only in her daily pilgrimages to Millbrook Cemetery, where her husband Arthur lay buried beneath the cold earth. The polished headstone had become her anchor in a life unmoored by grief. But on one fateful evening, as Elizabeth took her final steps towards the cemetery gates, her customary departure was abruptly halted. A flash of pink caught her eye. A small black girl in a worn dress, slipping between the iron bars of the fence. The child made her way purposefully through the sea of grey headstones, finally kneeling before Arthur's grave and gently placing a bouquet of white flowers at its base. Who was this child that dared to intrude upon Elizabeth's private mourning, and why did she seem to share such an intimate connection with Arthur's final resting place? Before we dive into this heartbreaking story, tell us in the comments where you're watching or listening from today. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Elizabeth Carter stood at the edge of the cemetery, her eyes fixed on the polished granite headstone that bore her husband's name. "Rest in peace, Arthur," it read, the words etched deep into the stone as if trying to match the depth of her grief. At 57, Elizabeth felt as though half of her had been buried alongside Arthur. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly trimmed grass, painting the cemetery in hues of gold and amber. It was beautiful, Elizabeth thought, in a melancholy sort of way. She'd never noticed the beauty of this place before Arthur's passing. Now it was a daily pilgrimage, a ritual that both comforted and pained her. As she stood there, memories of Arthur flooded her mind. Their first date at the local diner, where Arthur had nervously spilled his coffee all over himself. Their wedding day, when he'd looked at her with such adoration it had brought tears to her eyes. The countless evenings spent on their porch swing, talking about everything and nothing at all. Each memory was a treasure and a torment, reminding her of what she'd lost. One memory in particular played on repeat in her mind, their last day together. If only she'd known it would be their final goodbye, she would have held him tighter, kissed him longer, told him once more how much she loved him. The weight of those unspoken words and unrealized actions pressed heavily on her heart. "I miss you, Arthur," she whispered, her fingers tracing the letters of his name. "I miss you so much it hurts." Elizabeth stood there for a long while, lost in her thoughts and memories. The cemetery had become her sanctuary, a place where she felt closest to Arthur. She knew it wasn't healthy to dwell so much on her loss, but she couldn't help it. The emptiness in her life seemed all-consuming. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Elizabeth reluctantly decided it was time to leave. She placed a gentle kiss on her fingertips and pressed them to Arthur's name before turning to go. Her steps were slow and measured as she made her way down the winding path towards the cemetery gates. Just as she neared the exit, a flash of pink caught her eye. Elizabeth blinked, focusing on the small figure that had just entered the cemetery. It was a little girl, no more than 8 years old, wearing a worn and slightly dirty pink dress. The child's dark skin contrasted sharply with the pale pink of her dress, making her stand out even more in the somber setting of the cemetery. Elizabeth frowned, puzzled by the sight. What was a young child doing here alone, especially at this hour? The girl walked with purpose, her eyes fixed straight ahead, seemingly oblivious to Elizabeth's presence. "Hi," Elizabeth called out softly, but the girl didn't respond. She continued her quiet walk into the cemetery, her small form soon disappearing behind a cluster of gravestones. For a moment, Elizabeth considered following the child, but the weight of her own grief and the lateness of the hour made her hesitate. Surely, she thought, the girl wasn't alone. Perhaps a parent or guardian was nearby. With a final glance over her shoulder, Elizabeth left the cemetery, the image of the little girl in the pink dress lingering in her mind. It was an odd encounter, she mused, but grief often made the world seem strange and out of sorts. By the time she reached her car, Elizabeth had almost convinced herself that the child had been a figment of her imagination, a brief distraction from her sorrow. As she drove home, the streets of her small town passed by in a blur. Elizabeth hardly noticed the familiar sights. The corner store where she and Arthur used to buy ice cream on hot summer nights, the park where they'd walk hand in hand every Sunday. Now these places were just painful reminders of what she'd lost. Arriving home, Elizabeth parked her car in the driveway and sat there for a moment, gathering the strength to face another evening alone in the house she'd shared with Arthur for over 3 decades. The silence that greeted her as she opened the front door was deafening. No cheerful "I'm home" from Arthur, no sounds of the evening news from the living room, no clatter of pots and pans as he attempted to surprise her with dinner. Elizabeth moved through the house like a ghost, turning on lights more out of habit than necessity. She paused in the kitchen, her hand hovering over the kettle. Should she make tea? Arthur had always insisted on a cup of tea in the evening. It soothes the soul, he'd say with a wink. But the thought of sitting alone with a cup of tea that Arthur would never share again made her throat tighten with unshed tears. Instead, she made her way to the living room, sinking into her favorite armchair. The house felt too big, too empty, without Arthur's larger-than-life presence filling every corner. Elizabeth's gaze fell on the mantelpiece, lined with photos of their life together. Wedding photos, vacation snapshots, candid moments caught on camera, each one a reminder of the happiness they'd shared and the future they'd planned together. One photo in particular caught her eye. It was from their 30th wedding anniversary, just a year before Arthur's sudden passing. They were standing in front of their favorite restaurant, Arthur's arm around her waist, both of them beaming at the camera. Elizabeth remembered that day vividly, the way Arthur had surprised her with a beautiful necklace, the way he'd held her close as they danced, the way he'd whispered, "I love you," in her ear as if it was the first time he'd ever said it. Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. She let them fall, too tired to fight against the tide of grief. This was her life now. Memories and tears, an endless cycle of remembering and mourning. As the evening wore on, Elizabeth found herself drifting into a fitful sleep right there in the armchair. Her dreams were a confusing jumble of images: Arthur's smiling face, the little girl in the pink dress, gravestones stretching as far as the eye could see. She woke with a start sometime later, disoriented and with a crick in her neck. Glancing at the clock, Elizabeth realized it was past midnight. With a heavy sigh, she forced herself to her feet and made her way upstairs to bed. The bedroom, like the rest of the house, felt wrong without Arthur. His side of the bed remained untouched, the indent of his head still visible on the pillow. Elizabeth hadn't been able to bring herself to change the sheets since his passing. As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Elizabeth's mind wandered back to the little girl she'd seen at the cemetery. There had been something so out of place about her, so unexpected. In the darkness of the bedroom, Elizabeth found herself wondering about the child. Who was she? Why was she alone in the cemetery? And why couldn't Elizabeth shake the feeling that there was something important about her presence there? These questions swirled in Elizabeth's mind as she drifted off to sleep, providing a brief respite from her usual nighttime ruminations about Arthur. For the first time in months, Elizabeth's last thoughts before sleep weren't of her loss but of a mystery. A little girl in a pink dress walking alone among the graves. The next day dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the gaps in Elizabeth's curtains. For a brief, blissful moment between sleep and wakefulness, she forgot her loss. Then reality crashed back in, and the familiar ache settled in her chest. Elizabeth went through her morning routine mechanically: shower, dress, breakfast. She was just finishing her coffee when the doorbell rang. Glancing at the clock, she realized it was time for her regular visit from Jane. Jane had been Elizabeth's best friend for over 20 years. Since Arthur's passing, she'd made it a point to visit Elizabeth every week, usually bearing some small gift or treat. Today was no exception. "Elizabeth, darling," Jane said as soon as the door opened, holding out a beautiful bouquet of pink roses. "I saw these at the florist and thought of you." Elizabeth managed a small smile as she accepted the flowers. "They're lovely, Jane. Thank you." The two women made their way to the kitchen, where Elizabeth busied herself putting the roses in a vase while Jane prepared their coffee. It was a routine they'd fallen into over the past few months, comfortable in its familiarity. "So," Jane said once they were settled at the kitchen table, steaming mugs of coffee in front of them, "how are you doing, really?" Elizabeth sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "I'm managing," she said finally. "Some days are harder than others." Jane reached across the table, squeezing Elizabeth's hand. "I know, dear, it takes time. Arthur was, well, he was one of a kind." A lump formed in Elizabeth's throat at the mention of Arthur's name. "He really was," she whispered. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Jane, ever the practical one, began to chat about the latest town gossip, Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses, the new family that had moved in down the street, the upcoming bake sale at the church. Elizabeth listened with half an ear, grateful for Jane's attempts to distract her. As her friend talked, Elizabeth's gaze drifted to the vase of pink roses on the counter. Something about the color tickled at her memory, but she couldn't quite place it. "Elizabeth, are you listening?" Jane's voice broke through her reverie. "I'm sorry, what were you saying?" Elizabeth blinked, focusing back on her friend. Jane gave her a sympathetic smile. "I was just asking if you'd like to come to the bake sale next week. It might do you good to get out of the house a bit more." Elizabeth hesitated. The thought of facing a crowd of well-meaning but pitying neighbors made her stomach churn. I'm not sure, Jane. Maybe." Jane nodded, not pushing the issue. "Well, think about it, no pressure." They chatted for a while longer, Jane filling the silence with cheerful chatter, while Elizabeth sipped her coffee and tried to engage. By the time Jane left, promising to call later in the week, Elizabeth felt both drained and oddly comforted. After seeing Jane out, Elizabeth returned to the kitchen. She stood there for a moment, her eyes drawn once again to the pink roses. Suddenly it clicked. The little girl's dress. It had been almost the same shade of pink. The memory of the child in the cemetery came flooding back. Elizabeth had almost convinced herself it had been a dream or a grief-induced hallucination. But now, looking at the roses, she was certain the girl had been real. Elizabeth moved to the living room, settling onto the couch. She tried to relax, to push thoughts of the mysterious girl out of her mind. But the image persisted, a small figure in a worn pink dress, walking alone among the gravestones. Who was she? Why was she there? And why did Elizabeth feel so drawn to this mystery? As she sat there, lost in thought, the timer in the kitchen went off with a shrill beep. Elizabeth started, suddenly remembering the cake she'd put in the oven before Jane's arrival. It was a simple lemon cake, Arthur's favorite. She'd been baking one every week since his passing, unable to break the habit, even though there was no one left to enjoy it with her. Rising from the couch, Elizabeth made her way back to the kitchen. As she pulled the golden cake from the oven, the scent of lemon and sugar filling the air, she found herself blinking back tears. How many times had she baked this cake for Arthur? How many times had he praised her baking skills, even when the cake was a little dry or the frosting a bit too sweet? Setting the cake on the counter to cool, Elizabeth leaned against the kitchen sink, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Grief washed over her in waves, threatening to pull her under. She allowed herself a few moments of release before taking a deep breath and straightening up. Arthur wouldn't want her to fall apart over a cake, she told herself firmly. As she wiped her eyes and began to clean up the kitchen, Elizabeth's mind drifted back to the little girl in the cemetery. There was something about that child, something that nagged at the edges of her consciousness. Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. She resolved to return to the cemetery the next day. Perhaps she would see the girl again. And if she did, this time she would approach her, find out who she was, and why she was there alone. With this decision made, Elizabeth felt a small spark of something. Not quite hope, but perhaps a sense of purpose. For the first time since Arthur's passing, she had something to focus on beyond her grief. It was a small thing, perhaps even a foolish one, but it was something. As the day wore on into evening, Elizabeth found herself oddly restless. She paced the house, straightening pictures that didn't need straightening, dusting surfaces that were already clean. Her mind kept circling back to the girl in the pink dress, creating scenarios and explanations for her presence in the cemetery. Was she lost? A runaway? Or perhaps she was visiting a loved one's grave just as Elizabeth was. But why would she be alone? Where were her parents or guardians? These questions chased each other around Elizabeth's mind as she prepared for bed that night. As she lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, Elizabeth realized that for the first time in months, her last thoughts before sleep weren't solely of Arthur. Instead, they were of a mystery, a little girl in a pink dress walking alone among the graves. And with those thoughts came a tiny flicker of something Elizabeth had almost forgotten: curiosity. The next morning, Elizabeth woke with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in months. She went through her morning routine with more energy than usual, her mind focused on the task ahead, returning to the cemetery and hopefully seeing the little girl again. As she drove to the cemetery, Elizabeth's heart beat a little faster. She couldn't explain even to herself why she felt so drawn to this mystery. Perhaps it was simply a distraction from her grief, something to focus on beyond the endless cycle of loss and remembrance. Or perhaps it was something more, a connection she couldn't yet understand. Arriving at the cemetery, Elizabeth parked her car and made her way to Arthur's grave. She placed fresh flowers by the headstone, her fingers lingering on the cool marble as she whispered a soft greeting to her late husband. Then, instead of leaving as she usually would, she settled onto a nearby bench, her eyes scanning the cemetery for any sign of the little girl. Time seemed to crawl by. Elizabeth watched as other visitors came and went, tending to graves or simply paying their respects. But there was no sign of the girl in the pink dress. Just as Elizabeth was beginning to think she had imagined the whole thing, a flash of pink caught her eye. There she was, the same little girl, wearing the same worn pink dress. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat as she watched the child make her way through the cemetery with purposeful steps. To Elizabeth's surprise, the girl was heading straight for Arthur's grave. Elizabeth remained perfectly still, not wanting to startle the child. From her position on the bench, she had a clear view of Arthur's grave and the little girl who now stood before it. The scene that unfolded before Elizabeth's eyes left her breathless. The girl carefully placed her small backpack on the ground and pulled out a bunch of white flowers. With gentle movements, she knelt in front of Arthur's grave and arranged the flowers carefully. Elizabeth's heart ached at the sight. Who was this child, and why did she seem to have such a connection to Arthur? She watched, transfixed, as the girl's small figure began to shake. It took Elizabeth a moment to realize the child was crying. Unable to bear the sight of the girl's distress, Elizabeth slowly rose from the bench and began to approach. She moved quietly, not wanting to startle the child. As she drew closer, she could hear the girl's soft voice, speaking to the grave as if in conversation with Arthur himself. Elizabeth's mind whirled with questions. How did this child know Arthur? Why hadn't Arthur ever mentioned her? And why was she here alone, clearly in such distress? Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth softly said, "Hello." The effect was immediate. The girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. Before Elizabeth could say another word, the child hastily wiped her tears away, her small hands trembling. "Wait," Elizabeth said gently, taking a step closer. "It's okay, I just want to talk to you." But her words fell on deaf ears. The girl scrambled to her feet, snatching up her backpack. In her haste, she knocked over the flowers she had so carefully arranged. Without a backward glance, she took off running, her pink dress fluttering behind her as she disappeared among the tombstones. Elizabeth stood there, stunned by the sudden turn of events. She looked down at the scattered white flowers on Arthur's grave, her mind a whirlwind of questions and confusion. Kneeling down, she gently gathered the flowers, arranging them back in place. As she did so, she noticed they were simple wildflowers, the kind that grew in the meadow just beyond the cemetery walls. "Oh, Arthur," she whispered, her fingers tracing the letters of his name on the headstone. "What's going on? Who is she?" For the first time since his passing, Elizabeth felt a spark of something other than grief, curiosity, concern, and a deep need to understand. She stayed at the grave for a while longer, lost in thought before finally making her way back to her car. The drive home was a blur, Elizabeth's mind replaying the scene in the cemetery over and over. The girl's tears, her careful placement of the flowers, the way she had spoken to Arthur's grave as if he could hear her. It all pointed to a deep connection. But how? And why had Arthur never mentioned her? As she pulled into her driveway, Elizabeth made a decision. She would return to the cemetery again earlier this time. She needed answers, and the only way to get them was to speak with the girl. That night sleep eluded Elizabeth. She tossed and turned, her mind filled with images of the little girl in the pink dress. In her dreams, she saw Arthur and the child together, laughing and talking, but always just out of reach. She woke feeling more tired than when she had gone to bed, but with a renewed determination to solve this mystery. The next morning, Elizabeth woke before dawn. She dressed quickly, her movements driven by a sense of urgency she hadn't felt in months. As she left the house, the sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading as the first hints of sunrise painted the horizon. The cemetery was quiet and still when Elizabeth arrived. She made her way to a bench near Arthur's grave, settling in to wait. The morning air was cool, and Elizabeth pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. As she sat there watching the sky slowly brighten, she found herself talking softly to Arthur. "I wish you were here to explain all this," she murmured. "Who is she, Arthur? Why didn't you tell me about her?" Time seemed to crawl by. Elizabeth watched as the cemetery came to life around her. Birds beginning their morning songs, small animals scurrying about their business. She was beginning to think the girl wouldn't come when she noticed movement by the cemetery fence. Her heart quickened as she saw a small figure slipping through a gap in the fence. It was the girl, still wearing the same worn pink dress. Elizabeth held her breath, not daring to move as she watched the child make her way towards Arthur's grave. The girl's movements were hurried today, her head down as if she was afraid of being seen. She quickly pulled a small white branch of flowers from her backpack and placed them on the headstone. Elizabeth strained to hear as the girl whispered a few words to the grave, her voice too low to make out. Before Elizabeth could decide whether to approach, the girl was already turning to leave. Her departure was as quick as her arrival, her small form disappearing through the main gate of the cemetery. Elizabeth sat frozen for a moment, torn between staying at Arthur's grave and following the girl. Curiosity won out, and she found herself hurrying after the child, keeping a safe distance to avoid alarming her. The girl's path led them out of the cemetery and down several winding streets. Elizabeth's mind raced with possibilities. Where was the child going? Where were her parents? As they turned another corner, Elizabeth's questions were answered in a way she never expected. There, at the end of the street, stood an old brick building with a sign that read, "Sunnyside Orphanage." Elizabeth watched in stunned silence as the girl slipped through the front gates and disappeared inside. An orphanage. The realization hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. This little girl who seemed to have such a strong connection to Arthur was an orphan. But how? Why? The questions multiplied in Elizabeth's mind as she stood there, staring at the orphanage gates. After a moment of hesitation, Elizabeth made her way to the entrance. Her hand shook slightly as she pressed the buzzer, but her voice was steady when she spoke to the staff member who answered. "Hello," she said. "My name is Elizabeth Carter. I'd like to speak with someone about one of your children." The next hour passed in a blur for Elizabeth. She found herself sitting in a small office, facing a kind-faced woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Thompson, the head of the orphanage. "Mrs. Carter," Mrs. Thompson said gently, "you said you wanted to ask about one of our children." Elizabeth nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Yes, a little girl. She's about 8, I think. Wears a pink dress. I've seen her visiting my husband's grave." Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened in recognition. "You must mean Maya," she said. "Yes, she's been sneaking out to visit a cemetery. We've tried to stop her, but—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Mrs. Carter, how do you know about this?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, then began to explain everything. Her visits to Arthur's grave, her sightings of Maya, the girl's evident connection to her late husband. As she spoke, she watched Mrs. Thompson's expression change from confusion to understanding, and finally to a deep sadness. When Elizabeth finished, Mrs. Thompson was silent for a long moment. Then, with a heavy sigh, she began to speak. "Mrs. Carter, I think there's something you need to know about your husband and Maya." As Mrs. Thompson spoke, Elizabeth felt as if the world was tilting on its axis. She learned that Arthur had been a regular visitor to the orphanage for the past year, ever since Maya had arrived. He had taken a special interest in the girl, supporting her financially and emotionally through a severe illness that had required expensive medical treatment. Arthur was like a father to Maya, Mrs. Thompson explained gently. He visited her often, brought her books and toys. He even— She hesitated, glancing at Elizabeth. He had started the process of adopting her. Elizabeth felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Adopting? Arthur had been planning to adopt a child? Why hadn't he told her? As if reading her thoughts, Mrs. Thompson continued, "He wanted it to be a surprise, I think. He talked about how much you had always wanted a child, how this would complete your family." Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes as the full weight of the revelation hit her. Arthur had found them a daughter, had been preparing to bring this little girl into their lives. And then he had died, leaving both Elizabeth and Maya alone in their grief. Can I see her?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Thompson nodded, rising from her chair. "Of course, I'll go get her." As Elizabeth waited, her mind whirled with emotions, grief for the future that had been lost, anger at Arthur for keeping this secret, and an overwhelming sense of connection to the little girl she had yet to meet properly. The door opened, and Elizabeth looked up to see Maya standing there, her small hand clasped in Mrs. Thompson's. The girl's eyes were wide and uncertain as she looked at Elizabeth. "Maya," Mrs. Thompson said gently, "this is Mrs. Carter. She was Arthur's wife." Maya's eyes grew even wider at this, darting between Elizabeth and Mrs. Thompson. Elizabeth felt her heart constrict at the fear and hope warring in the child's expression. "Hello, Maya," Elizabeth said softly, kneeling down to be at eye level with the girl. "I've seen you at Arthur's grave. He meant a lot to you, didn't he?" Maya nodded, her lower lip trembling. "He was going to be my daddy," she whispered, her voice small and fragile. The words broke something open in Elizabeth's heart. Without thinking, she opened her arms, and Maya flew into them, her small body shaking with sobs. Elizabeth held her close, her own tears falling freely as she rocked the grieving child. In that moment, as she held this little girl who Arthur had chosen to be their daughter, Elizabeth felt a shift in her world. The grief that had consumed her for so long began to make room for something else, a fierce protectiveness, a deep compassion, and the first stirrings of love for this child who had lost so much. "It's okay, sweetheart," Elizabeth murmured, stroking Maya's hair. "It's okay, we're going to be okay." And for the first time since Arthur's death, Elizabeth believed those words might actually be true. As Elizabeth held Maya, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. She remembered Arthur's mysterious phone calls, the times he'd come home later than usual with a secretive smile on his face. At the time, she'd attributed it to work or perhaps planning a surprise for their anniversary. Now she realized he had been here at the orphanage, spending time with Maya, preparing to bring her into their lives. Mrs. Thompson gave them some privacy, stepping out of the office. When Maya's sobs finally subsided, Elizabeth gently pulled back, wiping the tears from the girl's cheeks with tender hands. "Maya, sweetheart," she said softly, "can you tell me about Arthur? About the time you spent with him?" Maya nodded, hiccuping slightly as she tried to calm her breathing. He was so nice," she began, her voice small but steady. "He came to see me every week. He'd read me stories and bring me candy sometimes." Elizabeth smiled, recognizing Arthur's sweet tooth in this detail. That sounds just like him, she encouraged. What else? When I got sick, Maya continued, her eyes growing distant with the memory, he stayed with me in the hospital. He held my hand when I was scared and told me funny stories to make me laugh. Elizabeth felt a fresh wave of tears threatening to spill over. This was the Arthur she knew and loved, kind, compassionate, always ready with a joke to lighten a heavy moment. She could picture him sitting by a hospital bed, his large hand engulfing Maya's tiny one, his warm voice spinning tales to distract her from her pain. He talked about you, Maya said suddenly, her eyes focusing on Elizabeth's face. He said you were the kindest person he knew, that you had so much love to give. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. He said that? Maya nodded emphatically. He said you'd be the best mom ever, that's why... She trailed off, her lower lip trembling again. That's why what, sweetie? Elizabeth prompted gently. That's why I was so excited, Maya whispered. To have a mum and dad, to have a family. The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. She pulled Maya close again, her heart aching for this child who had come so close to having the family she longed for, only to have it snatched away by cruel fate. Oh, Maya, she murmured, stroking the girl's hair. I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. They sat like that for a long while, holding each other, sharing their grief and finding comfort in their shared love for Arthur. When Mrs. Thompson gently knocked on the door, Elizabeth was surprised to realize how much time had passed. Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Thompson said softly, I hate to interrupt, but I thought you might like to see some things. Elizabeth nodded, reluctantly letting go of Maya. The girl clung to her hand as they followed Mrs. Thompson out of the office and down a hallway to a small bedroom. Maya's room, Elizabeth realized as they stepped inside. The room was sparsely furnished but tidy. What caught Elizabeth's eye immediately was a shelf above the bed, filled with books and small toys. She recognized Arthur's taste in the collection of children's classics and the carefully chosen stuffed animals. But it was the framed photograph on the bedside table that made her gasp. It was a picture of Arthur and Maya, taken what must have been only weeks before his death. They were at a park, Arthur pushing Maya on a swing, both of them laughing with pure joy. Elizabeth picked up the frame with trembling hands, studying the happiness radiating from both their faces. He brought that for her last month, Mrs. Thompson explained softly. Said he wanted her to have a picture of her new dad to look at every night before she went to sleep. Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. She glanced at Maya, who was watching her anxiously, as if afraid Elizabeth might be angry about the photo. It's a beautiful picture, Elizabeth managed to say, smiling at Maya through her tears. You both look so happy. Maya's face lit up at these words and she moved closer to Elizabeth, pointing at the photo. That was the best day, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of joy and sadness. Arthur. He took me to the park and bought me ice cream. He said it was practice for when I came to live with you both. Elizabeth's heart clenched at Maya's slip, Dad, and the way she had quickly corrected herself. She set the photo back on the bedside table and knelt down to Maya's level, taking both of the girl's hands in hers. Maya, she said softly, I want you to know something. Arthur, he was your dad, in every way that matters, and I know he loved you very, very much. Maya's eyes filled with tears again, but this time there was a spark of hope in them. Really? She whispered. Really, Elizabeth confirmed, squeezing Maya's hands gently. And I'd like to get to know you, if that's okay. To hear more about the time you spent with Arthur, and to tell you about him too. Would you like that? Maya nodded eagerly, a small smile breaking through her tears. Yes, please, she said. As Elizabeth stood up, still holding Maya's hand, she felt a shift in her heart. The grief was still there, a constant ache for Arthur and the future they'd lost. But alongside it, there was something new, a warmth, a sense of purpose, and the first stirrings of love for this little girl who Arthur had chosen to be their daughter. She looked at Mrs. Thompson, who had been watching the interaction with a mixture of sadness and hope. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked, her voice steady despite the emotional whirlwind of the past few hours. Mrs. Thompson smiled gently. "Well, that depends on you, Mrs. Carter, and on Maya, of course. But if you're both willing, I think we have a lot to talk about." Elizabeth nodded, feeling a sense of determination settling over her. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let go of this connection Arthur had forged. Whatever came next, she and Maya would face it together. As Elizabeth drove home that evening, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts. The day's revelations had shaken her to her core, forcing her to reevaluate everything she thought she knew about her life with Arthur and their future together. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the house she had shared with Arthur for so many years. It had felt empty and lifeless since his passing, but now it seemed to hold the promise of new beginnings. Elizabeth made her way inside, moving on autopilot to the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea. As the kettle boiled, her eyes fell on a framed photo on the counter, a picture of her and Arthur on their wedding day. She picked it up, studying Arthur's beaming face. "Oh, Arthur," she whispered, tracing his features with a gentle finger. "Why didn't you tell me?" As she stood there holding the photo, the full weight of the day's discoveries washed over her. Arthur had found them a daughter. He had been preparing to fulfill their long-held dream of having a child, a dream that had been shattered years ago when they learned Elizabeth couldn't conceive. Memories flooded back, the countless doctor's appointments, the failed treatments, the nights spent crying in each other's arms. They had talked about adoption back then, but the pain had been too raw, the disappointment too fresh. Over time, they had convinced themselves that they were happy as they were, just the two of them. But Arthur had never given up on that dream, Elizabeth realized now. He had found Maya, had seen in her the daughter they had always longed for, and he had been planning to surprise Elizabeth with the greatest gift imaginable, a child to love, a family to complete their lives. The kettle's whistle broke through Elizabeth's reverie. She set down the wedding photo and prepared her tea, moving to the living room with the steaming cup. As she sank into her favorite armchair, her eyes fell on the mantelpiece lined with photos of her life with Arthur. One photo in particular caught her attention. It was from their 30th wedding anniversary, just a year before Arthur's passing. They were standing in front of their favorite restaurant, Arthur's arm around her waist, both of them beaming at the camera. Elizabeth remembered that day vividly, the way Arthur had surprised her with a beautiful necklace, the way he'd held her close as they danced, the way he'd whispered "I love you" in her ear as if it was the first time he'd ever said it. Now, looking at that photo, Elizabeth saw something she hadn't noticed before. There was a sparkle in Arthur's eyes, a secret joy that went beyond the happiness of the moment. Had he already met Maya by then? Was he already planning their future as a family of three? Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. But these weren't just tears of grief. There was something else mixed in, gratitude for the man Arthur had been, for the love he had shown not just to her but to a little girl who needed a family. And there was something else too, a feeling Elizabeth hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. As the tears flowed, Elizabeth found herself talking to Arthur as if he were there in the room with her. "Oh, Arthur," she said softly, "you always knew what I needed, didn't you? Even when I didn't know myself." She wiped her eyes, a watery smile forming on her lips. "You found us a daughter. You were going to make us parents after all these years." The realization hit her anew, bringing with it a fresh wave of emotion. Arthur had wanted to surprise her with Maya, to bring joy and new life into their world, but fate had intervened, leaving both Elizabeth and Maya alone in their grief. Or were they? As Elizabeth sat there, surrounded by memories of her life with Arthur, she began to see things from a new perspective. Yes, Arthur was gone, and the pain of his loss would always be a part of her, but he had left her with one final gift, a connection to a little girl who needed love just as much as Elizabeth did. Maya's face flashed in Elizabeth's mind, her big, expressive eyes, the way she had clung to Elizabeth when they hugged, the joy in her voice when she talked about Arthur. This child, who Arthur had chosen to be their daughter, was now alone in the world, or was she? Elizabeth sat up straighter, a sense of purpose filling her for the first time since Arthur's passing. Maybe this wasn't the end of a dream, but the beginning of a new one. Maybe, just maybe, she and Maya could help each other heal, could become the family that Arthur had envisioned for them. The thought both terrified and exhilarated Elizabeth. Could she do it? Could she open her heart to this child, become the mother that Maya needed? The mother that Arthur had believed she could be? As these questions swirled in her mind, Elizabeth's gaze fell on a photo of Arthur from their last vacation together. He was smiling at the camera, his eyes twinkling with that familiar mix of love and mischief. Looking at that photo, Elizabeth could almost hear his voice in her head. "You can do this, Lizzie," he seemed to say. "You have so much love to give. Don't let fear hold you back." Elizabeth took a deep breath, feeling something settle in her heart. She didn't have all the answers yet, didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let go of this connection Arthur had forged. She owed it to Arthur, to Maya, and to herself to see where this path might lead. Rising from her chair, Elizabeth moved to the phone. Her hands shook slightly as she dialed the number for Sunnyside Orphanage, but her voice was steady when Mrs. Thompson answered. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Elizabeth Carter. I've been thinking, I'd like to talk more about Maya. About what happens next." As she spoke these words, Elizabeth felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time since Arthur's passing, she felt a glimmer of excitement for the future. Whatever came next, she would face it with the love Arthur had given her, and the strength he had always believed she possessed. This wasn't the end of her story with Arthur, Elizabeth realized. In a way, it was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that he had written the first pages of, leaving her to continue the tale. And as she made plans to visit Maya again, Elizabeth felt ready to pick up that pen and start writing. The next morning, Elizabeth woke early, a mixture of nervousness and anticipation fluttering in her stomach. She had arranged with Mrs. Thompson to visit Maya again today, this time with the intention of having a real conversation about their shared connection to Arthur and what it might mean for their future. As she got ready, Elizabeth found herself taking extra care with her appearance. She chose a soft blue sweater that Arthur had always said brought out her eyes, and she even applied a touch of makeup, something she hadn't bothered with since his passing. Looking in the mirror, she saw a spark of life in her eyes that had been missing for months. The drive to the orphanage seemed both longer and shorter than before. Elizabeth's mind raced with thoughts of what she would say to Maya, how she would explain the complicated emotions she was feeling. Before she knew it, she was pulling into the parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she took a few deep breaths to calm her nerves. Mrs. Thompson met her at the door, a warm smile on her face. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," she said. "Maya's been asking about you all morning. She's very excited to see you again." Elizabeth felt a rush of warmth at these words. "I'm excited to see her too," she admitted. "And please call me Elizabeth." Mrs. Thompson nodded, leading her down the hallway to her office. "Maya's waiting inside," she explained. "I thought you might like some privacy for your talk." Elizabeth nodded gratefully, pausing outside the door. "Mrs. Thompson," she said softly, "I want you to know. I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen next, but I want to do right by Maya, by what Arthur wanted for her." Mrs. Thompson's eyes softened. "I believe you will, Elizabeth. Just follow your heart." With these words of encouragement, Elizabeth took a deep breath and opened the door. Maya was sitting in one of the chairs, her legs swinging nervously. When she saw Elizabeth, her face lit up with a smile that went straight to Elizabeth's heart. "Hi, Maya," Elizabeth said softly, moving to sit in the chair next to her. "How are you doing today?" Maya's smile faltered a bit, her eyes filling with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I'm okay," she said. Are you here to talk about Arthur?" Elizabeth nodded, reaching out to take Maya's small hand in hers. "Yes, sweetie. I thought we could talk about Arthur, and about you, and about what happens next. Would that be okay?" Maya nodded eagerly, her grip on Elizabeth's hand tightening. Can I tell you something first?" she asked hesitantly. "Of course," Elizabeth said, giving Maya an encouraging smile. "You can tell me anything." Maya took a deep breath, her words coming out in a rush. "I'm sorry I ran away from you at the cemetery. I was scared you'd be mad at me for visiting Arthur. I didn't want you to think I was trying to take him away from you." Elizabeth felt her heart constrict at these words. "Oh, Maya," she said softly, pulling the girl into a gentle hug. "You don't have to apologize. I'm not mad at you at all. In fact, I'm glad you were visiting Arthur. It shows how much you cared about him." Maya relaxed into the hug, her small arms wrapping around Elizabeth's waist. "He was so nice to me," she said, her voice muffled against Elizabeth's sweater. "He made me feel special, like I mattered." Elizabeth stroked Maya's hair gently, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "You do matter, Maya. You mattered so much to Arthur. And you matter to me too." Maya pulled back slightly, looking up at Elizabeth with wide eyes. "Really?" she asked, her voice small and hopeful. "Really," Elizabeth confirmed, smiling through her tears. "Maya, there's something I need to tell you, something about Arthur and me and about you." And so, Elizabeth began to explain. She told Maya about her and Arthur's long struggle to have a child, about their dream of becoming parents. She explained how Arthur had found Maya and had seen in her the daughter they had always wanted. As she spoke, she watched Maya's face carefully, seeing the emotions play across her features: surprise, joy, sadness, hope. "Arthur wanted us to be a family," Elizabeth said softly. "He was planning to bring you home to live with us. He wanted to surprise me with the most wonderful gift I could imagine, a daughter." Maya's eyes filled with tears. "But then he died," she whispered. Elizabeth nodded, her own eyes watering. "Yes, sweetheart, he died before he could make it happen. But Maya, I want you to know something. Just because Arthur is gone, it doesn't mean that dream has to die too." Maya's breath caught, her eyes widening. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her heart pounding. This was the moment of truth, the moment that would change both their lives forever. "Maya," she said softly, "I know we don't know each other very well yet, but I'd like to change that. If you're willing, I'd like us to spend more time together, to get to know each other better, and maybe we could see if we might become a family, just like Arthur wanted." Maya's eyes grew impossibly wide, her mouth falling open in shock. For a moment she just stared at Elizabeth, as if unable to believe what she was hearing. Then, with a cry that was half sob and half laugh, she threw herself into Elizabeth's arms. "Yes," she cried, her voice muffled against Elizabeth's shoulder. "Yes, please, I want that so much." Elizabeth held Maya close, her own tears falling freely now. As she sat there holding this little girl who Arthur had chosen to be their daughter, she felt something shift in her heart. The grief that had consumed her for so long began to make room for something else: hope, joy, and the first stirrings of a mother's love. "We'll take it one day at a time," Elizabeth murmured, stroking Maya's hair. "We'll get to know each other, and we'll figure this out together. Okay?" Maya nodded against her shoulder, her arms tightening around Elizabeth's neck. "Okay," she whispered. Thank you so much." As they sat there holding each other, Elizabeth felt a sense of peace settle over her. She knew there would be challenges ahead, knew that becoming a family wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time since Arthur's passing, she felt truly alive, truly hopeful for the future. This, she realized, was Arthur's final gift to her. Not just a child to love, but a chance at a new beginning. A chance to honor his memory by creating the family he had always dreamed of. And as she held Maya close, Elizabeth silently promised Arthur that she would do everything in her power to make that dream a reality. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity and emotion for Elizabeth and Maya. With the help of Mrs. Thompson and the staff at Sunnyside Orphanage, they began the process of getting to know each other better, spending time together both at the orphanage and at Elizabeth's home. Their first outing together was a visit to the park, where Arthur had taken Maya that day, captured in the photograph. As they walked hand in hand down the same paths Arthur and Maya had travelled, Elizabeth felt a bittersweet ache in her heart. But seeing the joy on Maya's face as she relived happy memories and created new ones helped ease the pain. "Dad, I mean Arthur, he pushed me so high on the swings that day," Maya said, her eyes shining with the memory. "I felt like I could touch the sky." Elizabeth smiled, squeezing Maya's hand gently. "He always did love to make people laugh and have fun," she said. "Why don't we see if we can touch the sky together?" As they took turns pushing each other on the swings, their laughter echoing across the park, Elizabeth felt a warmth spreading through her chest. This, she realized, was what Arthur had wanted for them: joy, laughter, and the simple pleasure of being a family. Back at home, Elizabeth began to make changes to prepare for Maya's eventual arrival. She cleared out the spare room that had been serving as a storage space, transforming it into a bedroom fit for a little girl. She chose soft purple paint for the walls, remembering how Maya's eyes had lit up when she saw a purple stuffed animal at the orphanage. As she worked, Elizabeth found herself talking to Arthur, sharing her thoughts and fears as if he were right there beside her. "I hope I'm doing this right, Arthur," she'd say as she assembled a bookshelf or hung curtains. "I hope this is what you had in mind for us." One afternoon, as Elizabeth was putting the finishing touches on Maya's room, Mrs. Thompson called with some news. The adoption process was moving forward, and if everything continued to go well, Maya could come home with Elizabeth in just a few short weeks. The news sent a thrill of excitement and nervousness through Elizabeth. That evening, when Maya came for her regular visit, Elizabeth decided it was time to ask the big question. They were sitting on the porch swing, enjoying the warm evening air, when Elizabeth turned to Maya. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "I have something important to ask you." Maya looked up, her eyes curious and a little apprehensive. "What is it?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "Maya, you know I've been working on a special room in the house, right?" Maya nodded, and Elizabeth continued, "Well, that room is for you, and I was wondering, would you like to come live here with me? To make this your home?" Maya's eyes widened, filling with tears. For a moment she just stared at Elizabeth, her lower lip trembling. Then, with a cry of joy, she threw her arms around Elizabeth's neck. "Yes," she sobbed. "Yes, please, I want that more than anything." Elizabeth held Maya close, her own tears falling freely. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, stroking Maya's hair. "I'm so glad. I want that too, so very much." As they sat there on the porch swing, holding each other, Elizabeth felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was what Arthur had wanted for them. This was the family he had dreamed of creating. The days that followed were a flurry of preparations. There were papers to sign, final interviews with social workers, and last-minute adjustments to Maya's room. Through it all, Elizabeth felt Arthur's presence, guiding her, encouraging her, cheering her on. Finally, the day arrived. Elizabeth stood in the entrance of Sunnyside Orphanage, her heart pounding with anticipation. When Maya appeared, clutching a small suitcase and the stuffed bear Arthur had given her, Elizabeth felt her breath catch in her throat. "Are you ready to go home, sweetheart?" she asked softly, holding out her hand. Maya nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She took Elizabeth's hand, holding on tightly. "I'm ready," she said, her voice small but determined. As they walked out of the orphanage together, Elizabeth felt a shift in her world. The grief that had consumed her for so long didn't disappear, but it made room for something new: hope, joy, and the love of a mother for her child. In the car on the way home, Maya was quiet, looking out the window with wide eyes. Elizabeth glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her heart full of love for this little girl who had so unexpectedly become her daughter. "You okay, sweetie?" she asked gently. Maya nodded, turning to look at Elizabeth with a small smile. "I was just thinking," she said softly, "that Arthur would be happy right now, seeing us together like this." Elizabeth felt her heart swell with emotion. "I think you're right, sweetheart," she replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I think he'd be very happy indeed." As they pulled into the driveway of what was now their home, Elizabeth felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was it, the beginning of their new life together. "Welcome home, Maya," she said softly as they walked up to the front door. Maya's eyes were wide as she took in the house, clutching her stuffed bear tightly. "Our home," she whispered, as if testing out the words. Elizabeth nodded, squeezing Maya's hand gently. "That's right, sweetheart. Our home." Elizabeth's world transformed with Maya's arrival. The house, once quiet and filled with memories, now echoed with the sounds of a child's laughter and the pitter-patter of small feet. Each day brought new challenges and joys as they navigated their newfound family dynamic. Shopping for Maya's clothes became an adventure. Elizabeth watched, her heart full, as Maya's eyes lit up at the sight of colorful outfits and a shiny new backpack for school. These simple pleasures, once taken for granted, now held profound meaning. Nighttime proved challenging. Maya often woke, tears streaming down her face, calling for Arthur or the parents she barely remembered. In these moments, Elizabeth would gather the child in her arms, whispering soothing words and humming lullabies until Maya drifted back to sleep. Through it all, Elizabeth felt Arthur's presence guiding her. In quiet moments, she found herself talking to him, sharing her triumphs and doubts as she embraced motherhood. The call from the social worker came unexpectedly one evening. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she listened to the news. The judge had granted her temporary custody of Maya, while the full adoption was processed. The next morning, over a special breakfast of chocolate chip pancakes, Elizabeth shared the news with Maya. So this is really my home now?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth reached across the table, taking Maya's small hand in hers. "Yes, sweetheart, this is your home and I am your family, forever and always." Maya's radiant smile and tight embrace said more than words ever could. As Elizabeth held her close, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was what Arthur had wanted for them. Life took on a new rhythm as Elizabeth and Maya settled into their roles as mother and daughter. They celebrated their new status with small, joyful rituals, picnics in the backyard, planting flowers in the garden, and creating a scrapbook of their growing family memories. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing enjoying the warm summer air, Elizabeth turned to Maya with a gentle smile. "Sweetheart, I've been thinking, would you like to visit Arthur's grave together? We could bring him some flowers and spend some time there as a family." Maya looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of emotions, surprise, hesitation, and a glimmer of hope. "Really? We can go together." Elizabeth nodded, wrapping an arm around Maya's shoulders. "Of course, I think it would be nice for us to go as a family. We could even bring some of those white camellias Arthur loved so much. What do you think?" Maya was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I miss him, and I think he'd be happy if we went together." Elizabeth felt a lump form in her throat. "I think so too, sweetheart. We can go this weekend if you'd like." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Elizabeth and Maya sat in comfortable silence, both lost in thoughts of Arthur and the visit they would soon make together. The next Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. Hand in hand, Elizabeth and Maya walked the familiar paths of the cemetery, their steps sure and purposeful. They carried a bouquet of freshly cut white camellias from their garden. At the grave, Elizabeth felt the usual pang of grief, but it was tempered now by the warmth of Maya's hand in hers. This visit was different. She was no longer alone. Maya stepped forward, gently placing the bouquet of white camellias on the grave. "Hi, Dad," she said softly. "I miss you. But Elizabeth and I are okay. We're taking care of each other, just like you wanted." Elizabeth knelt beside Maya, her arm around the girl's shoulders. "We're a family now, Arthur," she added, her voice thick with emotion. "Just like you planned." As they knelt there together, Elizabeth felt a profound sense of peace. The grief was still there, but it no longer consumed her. Instead, it had made room for joy, for love, for the beautiful gift that Arthur had given her in Maya. "Should we plant some camellias around the grave?" Elizabeth suggested, "as a special tribute to Arthur?" Maya's face lit up. "Can we? That would be beautiful." Together they worked to plant a row of camellia bushes around Arthur's grave. As they patted the soil and watered the young plants, Elizabeth felt as though they were nurturing not just the flowers, but the love that Arthur had left behind. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the cemetery as they stood back to admire their work. The white camellia buds seemed to shimmer, a promise of beauty to come. "Do you think Dad would like it?" Maya asked, her hand slipping into Elizabeth's. Elizabeth squeezed Maya's hand gently. "I think he would love it, sweetheart," she said softly, "and I think he would love seeing us together like this even more." As they turned to leave, Elizabeth cast one last glance at Arthur's grave, now surrounded by the camellia bushes. "Thank you, my love," she whispered, "for everything." They walked out of the cemetery, no longer two individuals bound by grief and loss, but a family united by love and the beautiful gift Arthur had given them, each other. Thank you for joining me on this heartwarming tale of love, loss, and new beginnings. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being part of this journey.